Welcome, everybody. I'm Walter Isaacson, and I have the great pleasure of being along for the ride with everybody here at the Aspen Institute. This has been a totally amazing event with really some wonderful, provocative panels, talks, convenings, and I hope in the spirit of this that the provocative thoughts lead to really great actions, and that all of us can go forth from here with great projects and great action plans for how we're going to revise our ways of putting a dent in the universe. It's particularly interesting for me to be able to talk about the theme that is the theme of this year's Action Forum, which is collaborative leadership. Because on the side, I'm a biographer. And we biographers have a very dirty little secret, which is that we know we distort history a little bit. We make it seem like there's a guy or a gal who goes to a garage or a garret, and they have a light bulb moment, and change happens, and innovation occurs. That's not the way it works. The way real innovation, real change, and real creativity work is through collaboration. And I've learned that in all the projects I've watched you all do. I've sat there in the hub hearing people talking about their projects and others come up to them and saying, here's how I can help, or here's a way to bring it into fruition. And by doing that, I can see the natural way that the Institute, but specifically this Global Leaders Network, has created a sense of collaboration. And even here at the Institute, I kind of wander around and get sort of amazed at all the things happening here. And I realize that the one thing I've done was about 11 years ago, right after I was asked to be president of the Aspen Institute, somebody, Bill Mayer it was, said, you ought to have coffee with Peter Reiling, because he's somebody doing something interesting. So we had coffee. I said, come here and start this. And it became a collaborative effort. So everything that happens at the Institute is because of people like Peter or Elliot or Amy or everybody else who's been part of this collaborative process. And so that was the main thing I learned by coming here, was the value of collaboration. And it made me want to write a book that wasn't a biography. And so my latest book was about a series of unknown or little-known people from Ada Lovelace to J.C.R. Licklider, whose success became because they were collaborative leaders. And I thought in the few minutes I have, I'd just give 7 of the lessons of people who have been great collaborative leaders. The first lesson comes from the notion of building the computer. The computer and the internet are the 2 most important inventions of our time. But with all due respect to Al Gore, we don't exactly know who invented them. And the reason is because it was collaborative leadership that invented them. Building the computer wasn't the tough part. Building the team that would build the computer was the tough part. And so sometimes if you're a romantic biography, you had to pick somebody who invented the computer. Some people pick out this guy, John Atanasoff, who was a professor at Iowa State. But he was very much a loner. And in the basement of the physics building there, he tried to do an electronic circuit that would do Boolean algebra. And whenever he had a problem he ran into, there was nobody he was collaborating with, he would take a long drive in his car, sometimes drive all the way to the Illinois border so that he could think. I also think he went to the Illinois border because you couldn't buy alcohol by the drink in Iowa and you could in Illinois. And he'd go sit in the bar right there on the border and try to work it through. Well, he got some of the things right, but by the time he gets called into the Navy in 1942, the punch card burners aren't working, the mechanics aren't working. He didn't have a team to help him execute. He had the vision, but vision without execution is just hallucination. And he didn't have a team, so he couldn't execute. He would have been lost to history were it not for somebody at the other end of that spectrum, somebody who was a great collaborative leader, a guy named John Mauchly. And John Mauchly, when he wanted to build a computer, realized that the first step was building the team. So he went traveling around. He went to Bell Labs and looked at what they were doing there, went to Harvard to see a mechanical machine that Grace Hopper and Howard Aiken were working on, went up to Dartmouth, went to the 1939 World's Fair in New York, and then even heard about this dude out in Iowa and drove all the way out to Iowa to spend time with Atanasov. Spent 4 days picking his brain, like a bumblebee picking up pollen. Atanasov brought things together. Those of you who have built great businesses or great organizations probably have run into lawyers. And you know what happens next in this story. The intellectual property lawyers turned it into a 17-year intellectual property dispute as to whether or not Markley had stolen ideas from Atanasov. But in the world of creativity, we don't call that stealing. We call it collaboration. And in the end, Markley gets credit for inventing ENIAC, bringing in 6 great women mathematicians to program it, bringing in Presper Eckert, who was a great mechanical engineer whose grandfather invented a Turkish taffy machine. All these type of people he brought together so that a team of 80 could really execute on the computer. When I wrote about Steve Jobs, near the end of his life, I asked him what I thought was a simple question, which is, what product are you most proud of inventing? He bit my head off, which happens often. He said, you haven't been listening to me. He said, building a product is hard, but what's really hard is building a team that will continue to make great products. So my most important product that I ever created was a team at Apple that keeps innovating, not the iPod or the iPhone or the iPad. Another lesson of all the people I've written about is a lesson of humility. Peter Reiling said it at the very beginning in his opening speech that if you're going to be a good collaborator, it actually takes the virtue of humility. David Brooks has written an entire book on the virtue of humility, just came out, and has written about it often. And it made me think back to old Ben Franklin, one of the people I had written about. Because Franklin, when he came to Philadelphia, he did something like this. He created the Leather Apron Club. It's like the Aspen Institute in a way. It was to discuss great issues, but then make action plans for how you were going to build a hospital or a lending library or an academy for the education of youth or a militia, whatever, all these collaborations that get put together because of his idea of civic leadership. I was telling David just a moment ago, if you read every one of the proposals for those, he always does it sort of under a pseudonym, one of his fake, Poor Richard or something. And he always gives credit to somebody else for the idea that maybe we need a volunteer fire corps. Because he said that to build collaboration, you always have to share credit and give other people credit. But, he had trouble with that virtue of humility. With that Leather Apron Club, it met every Friday in Philadelphia on round tables like this. And they made the list of virtues that you had to do to be a really great citizen. And they were the plain old virtues, industry, honesty, frugality. Franklin's a geek, so he checks every week has he mastered each virtue. And at one point, he had mastered all 12 of the virtues. And he very proudly showed it to everybody in the club. And a member of the club, as you might expect, said, hey, Franklin, you're missing a virtue you might want to try. Franklin says, what's that? And the person says, humility. You should add that one to your list. Now, the great thing about Franklin is that he's very honest in his letters to his sister and his autobiography. He said, I was never very good at the virtue of humility. I could never master it. But then he goes on and says, but I was very good at the pretense of humility. I could fake it very well. Now, that's good, but here's the true genius of Franklin. And he says, and I learned that the pretense of humility was just as useful as the reality of humility. It made you listen to the person next to you, not try to judge their path, that they were doing good in this world. Bring them together and try to find the common ground with them. And that was the essence of the middle class type of democracy we were trying to form. Very rarely are the words Steve Jobs and humility used in the same sentence. But I thought about that, and I realized that even though he was rough on people, There were so many times when he gathered his great team together and he told them what he wanted to do, and they pushed back. In fact, they used to give an award to the person who was best able to stand up to Steve that year. First 3 years, by the way, it was won by women. But Steve, was a tough customer, but he knew how to realize that the people around him were sometimes smarter. One of the great and famous battles that lasted 9 months was when the iPhone comes out and everybody on his team and everybody on his board wants to have third-party apps, wants you to be able to take out your iPhone and just click on it like that and, have different Ubers and everything else be there, thousands of apps that you can have. And Steve said, no, I don't want to pollute my phone with third-party apps. And they kept pushing back on him. And finally, the way he showed humility was he said, okay, you assholes, if you think you're so smart, just go ahead and do it. And they said, that's the way Steve surrendered on any argument. Within a year, it's a $2 billion industry, and it also is a testament to the virtue of humility. We were talking about this earlier and just passing, and Skip came by going to the bathroom. We were talking about the dangers of people who sort of get on a high horse and say, this is the path, we have to do it, as opposed to the virtue of humility. And we recall that the last reading in the seminar often is the Isaiah Berlin reading, and Skip was able to quote it from heart to me about the danger of those who think that there's only one right path to the good life or the good universe or to helping others. And that if they believe that, they end up believing that there's a final solution to all the problems. Obviously, Berlin grew up in a particular place where the notion of a final solution was pretty tough. But the relative validity of the people's ideas at the table around you is a definition of humility. And as Isaiah Berlin said, that separates the barbaric from the civilized citizens. So thank you for reminding me of that, and that virtue of humility should be in part of all we do. Another thing that was an important lesson of people who were collaborators and showed collaborative leadership was that they believed and appreciated diversity of talent. Even back when they're trying to do the transistor at Bell Labs, it was a team that gets put together with people of all sorts of ideas and backgrounds. There's William Shockley, he's a real jerk, actually, by the end of his life, but he was a great quantum theorist then. They had John Bardeen, who had a physical background in certain types of quantum mechanics, but they also had Walter Brattain, who was an experimentalist and knew how to stick a paper clip into a piece of semiconducting material to get past the surface state. And they even had Alan Turing coming over from England with information theory, but they had pole climbers with grease under their fingernails who were trying to amplify phone signals as part of the team. And soon, in the end, they created Transistor. Shockley was not very good at sharing the credit. He insisted he be in every picture of the team and be right in the center. And that's why they all broke off from eventually, and people like Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore, instead of working with him, ended up forming Intel. But Bob Noyce was the one who figured out that if you're going to be a team, you really have to share the credit. You have to have different types of people around you. I think that's one of our great problems in our age, is that the appreciation of diversity, I see John there from New Orleans and LaToya, the creativity of New Orleans has always come from its diversity. Louis Armstrong is a great example of that, where at a given moment you have people from the Sanctified Church, freed slaves from the plantations coming into town, Congo Square where they're meeting. You have the French opera and the Creole foxtrot orchestras and Scott Joplin coming down, decommissioned soldiers from the Spanish-American War hawking their cornets in the pawn shops. And then you have Louis Armstrong in the middle of all of this, getting one of those horns, listening to the opera, being in Storyville, where his mother turned tricks, and listening to Jelly Roll Morton play the piano. And jazz is born out of that diversity. We have, in the past 20 or 30 years, become a society that's actually had less diversity, whether it's in the technology industry, whether it's in everything we do in life, whether it's in the dinners we go to. And I think that if we're going to be, in terms of collaboration and creativity, we have to reassert that every day we're going to do things to help improve the diversity of all the groups that we gather. Another lesson is that it tends to be place-based. Steve Jobs was very insistent that people come to work, that they have a big atrium in the Pixar building, that the new Apple headquarters will be in the round, so people will serendipitously run into each other. That's what you see here at the Hub or other things. When Peter and I were first working on the AGLN, he said, we have to have our own social networking app. And we spent a lot of money and some time doing it. Finally tried Facebook and to use it as a... But you know what? Virtual networks don't quite work as well as place-based things. It's why Marissa Mayer told people at Yahoo, you actually have to come in. And I think that there is a value of face-to-face human communication in a digital age. In terms of giving credit, and being more willing to give credit than take it, another lesson. I was really impressed with the Charleston panel, because when they decided they wanted the flag taken down, there was nobody barging out in the lead to be taking the credit or leading the charge. They did it collaboratively, and only through that did it work. It was a very moving panel. I noticed, too, that sometimes when you have that type of collaboration, it's tricky, but it works with competition as well, that you can be competitors, but competitors who also know how to respect and collaborate. Bob Noyce, who created Intel, got into one of those with Jack Kilby, who was at Texas Instruments. They were both racing to create the microchip, taking those transistors and etching many of them on a chip of silicon. In some ways, they both invented around the same time. Their lawyers start suing each other. They call each other up, say, call off the lawyers. We both did this. Let's cross-license it. And Noyce dies, but when Kilby is given the Nobel Prize, his first thing when he's told about it said, if Noyce were still alive, he'd be sharing this with me. He loved sharing credit and loved that notion of humility that comes from that. When the Swedish scientist gives Kilby the award in the white tie ceremony, and talks about the entire digital revolution comes down to this thing that you invented. You've changed our lives on this, that, and the other. Kilby gets up and just ad-libs. That reminds me of something that the beaver said to the rabbit at the foot of the Hoover Dam. No, I didn't actually build it, but it's based on my idea. And in terms of noble competition, one of them happened exactly 100 years ago this month, when Albert Einstein was about to develop the greatest theory in the history of science, general relativity. And he went up to Göttingen, where David Hilbert, the great mathematician, was there, and they kicked around the ideas. They shared ideas on it. And then Hilbert tried to race Einstein in terms of coming up with the mathematical equations that would express it. In some ways, in the same week, in November of 1915, 100 years ago, they come up with those equations. And there was sort of a battle then, especially because Einstein was Jewish, and the Germans weren't sure they wanted to give credit to him. And so Hilbert says, no, it was Einstein's theory. We collaborated on it, but he should get credit for the theory. And right afterwards, Einstein nominates Hilbert for one of the most prestigious academies there. So competition and collaboration working together was also a secret. And the final one, since I'm ending my time, is that it's peer-to-peer. It's not top-down. We are not going to tell you how to leave this action form and what action to take. This is a peer-to-peer group here, and the whole digital revolution is peer-to-peer, not command structure where people say, and here's what you should now do. When they were inventing the internet, it was to bring together a lot of research computers. And the Defense Department, which was funding them, wanted a network that would allow them to interact, share computing power. And being great research universities, they did what research professors always do. They delegated to their graduate students the task of figuring out how this network would work. So 30 graduate students started meeting, place-based meetings. They'd go from place to place every 6 months to come up with the protocols that would show how a packet switch network would work, where you had no central hub, you had no even regional hubs the way an airline does. Each and every node of the internet, they decided, would have equal power to store and forward packets. And in order to make it a collaborative effort, They didn't even want to hand down rules and regulations. They made the youngest of the graduate students, a guy named Steve Crocker, take notes, and he wrestled with what do we call these protocols or things. And finally, he decided to call them requests for comment, because it was a way to make it seem the most collaborative. So every single one of the rules of the road of the internet, showing how a packet will be addressed, or how it recombines, or how a transmission control tells you where, if something's missing, all came with RFCs, requests for comment. Now that's pretty cool, but even cooler is the fact that that's still how the internet's being built. We're up to 7,927 in the RFC process. We still call it request for comment. There's nobody in charge. And the fingerprints of that type of collaboration, of that, what they built, the DNA is inbred in the internet. So it's a peer-to-peer type of collaboration. We at Time magazine in the 1990s wrote they did it that way so that it would survive a Russian nuclear attack. Because you take out one node, it just routes around it as opposed to having a central switch. We got a letter from Steve Crocker, who I'd never heard of, saying, no, that's not why we did it. Hey, we were graduates, we're all dodging the draft. We weren't trying to do things with the Pentagon. We did it so that we could all be in control, we could all collaborate, instead of having a top-down hierarchical structure. Time was very arrogant back then. I know, because I was there. And so we didn't print the letter. We said we had a better source. I had forgotten about this until I interviewed Steve for the book. I said, oh, yeah, I remember that. And so I called Nancy Gibbs, the editor at the time. I said, have somebody, if you would, go to the files and archives and find out who that better source was. There's a guy named Steve Lukasich, who actually ran ARPA, the place in the Pentagon that was funding this. And he said, yeah, we were doing it to survive a Russian attack. We didn't tell the graduate students that. They were all draft dodgers. But, that's how we got money out of the Pentagon, It wasn't so that they could play video games on distant computers. And so he said to me, you tell Steve Crocker that, he was on the bottom and I was on the top. So he didn't know what was happening. And I told Crocker that. I went to a COSI out in Bethesda where he lives. He stroked his chin. He said, you tell Lukasich, he was on the top and I was on the bottom. So he didn't know what was happening. And that is the nature of collaborative creativity in the digital age. I'll leave you just with one further thought, I know my time is up, is that all of these people I talked about, an essence to their belief in collaboration was that it was about something larger than themselves. It wasn't just them. In the summer of 2011, when Steve Jobs was, losing his race to cancer, I went out and said, what is it you've learned from all this? What do you feel, your mission was? What was the purpose of it all? And he said, I studied Zen Buddhism, and I learned that history is like a river and life is like a river. You get to take things out of the river that really wonderful people before you invented. You get to take their ideas, you get to take the devices they invented, you get to take all sorts of theories and wonderful organizations they created. You get to take so many things out of the river. He said, but I've now come to realize that what life is all about is not how much you got to take out of the river, but how much you got to put into the river. Those little things you might have put in the river that a few years from now, a few decades from now, a century from now, people might say, that was cool. Somebody put that in the river before me. As for Einstein, his wonderful theory of relativity that he and Hilbert did somewhat collaboratively was, as I said, the greatest theory in the history of science. But it has one flaw. The flaw is that when it rubs up against the other theory that Einstein came up with in the last century, quantum theory, it doesn't quite mesh. Right at the intersection of relativity and quantum, it doesn't quite work. There's an uncertainty principle. Things seem to happen by chance. Einstein was very spiritual. He always said, I cannot believe God would play dice with the universe as God. And so on his deathbed, for 30 years, he had been working on a unified field theory that would try to tie it all together. And on his deathbed, his last day, he had an aneurysm that burst. He asked Helen Dukas, his secretary, to bring him his papers. So after everybody left at 9 p.m., the Princeton Hospital, he spends the next few hours writing 9 more pages, line after line of equations, on the unified field theory that he thought would just get him and the rest of us one step closer to that spirit manifest in the laws of the universe. And you see the last line dribble off as he dies. And as for Franklin, he donated to the building fund of each and every church that was built in Philadelphia. And at one point, they were building a new hall to the left of Independence Hall. It's still there. It's still called the New Hall. And on the fundraising document, he said, even if the Mufti of Constantinople were to send somebody here to preach Islam to us and to teach us about the Prophet Muhammad, we should offer them a pulpit and we should listen, for we might learn something. And on his deathbed, he was the largest individual contributor to the Mikveh Israel synagogue, the first synagogue built in Philadelphia. So when he died, instead of his minister accompanying his casket to the grave, all 35 ministers, preachers, and priests linked arms with the rabbi of the Jews in Philadelphia to march with him to the grave. It was that type of larger collaboration, believing you're part of something larger than yourselves, that people from different backgrounds and different approaches and different ways of doing good should all work together. That was what they were fighting for back then, 250 years ago, and is what we're still fighting for, not only around the world, but very much so here at home in America. Thank you all very much.